All right, in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about a different answer to the question of what justifies political authority, and the answer here is necessity. Let me talk a little bit about Jeremy Waldron, from whose work this lecture is largely inspired. Now, Waldron's a contemporary political philosopher. The text that you were assigned consists of excerpts from the introduction to his 1999 book, Law and Disagreement. It's a really good book about democracy, about law, and about political authority more generally. I highly recommend it, despite the fact that some of the chapters may be a little bit difficult. Now, the immediate relevance of this text for us, in the context of where we are in the course right now, is the outline of an argument that authority is necessary despite our disagreements about what justice is. Now, um, I say the outline of an argument because the introduction of a book never provides the full argument. It just provides an outline of what the argument might look like. It turns out that looking at the argument in detail would require a lot of time, and it's written in a kind of philosophical language that I think isn't particularly accessible to undergrads. Again, I do recommend that you go pick it up. I made the library purchase a copy a few years ago, so I know the Austin P Library has it, but we're going to just try to look at the outlines of the argument. And I think doing that is more than enough for our purposes. So Waldron introduces an idea called the circumstances of politics. And by that he means that politics always occurs against the backdrop of disagreement, and even disagreement about fundamental values, like what rights we have. So it's not just the case that we disagree about technical questions like how to provide health care for everyone. We disagree about whether health care is a right. In fact, we disagree about what it means to have a right and what such a right to health care might look like. So that is to say, two people who agree that we have a right to health care might well be talking about two different kinds of moral claims because they disagree about exactly what counts as a right. So politics occurs against the backdrop of disagreement, and this doesn't surprise anybody. I think in our first week, when we talked about what politics was, we noted that a lot of the time politics is precisely concerned with the areas where we have disagreements. But not all politics are about moral disagreements. Sometimes the disagreements are perhaps more technical. But he's making the point that in circumstances even approaching those of a free society, people are going to disagree about what justice is. They're just going to disagree about what counts as the right thing to do. And yet people still need to live together. They still need to cooperate on a variety of issues despite their disagreements. That is to say, they want to buy houses and cars, and they want to produce things together, and they want to operate clubs, and they want to run churches, and they want to get to work and get back from work. The point here is that despite everybody's disagreements about the controversial questions of politics, like abortion and gun rights and all the other rights that we might, rights to immigration and so on and so forth, people still need to go about their lives doing a whole bunch of mundane tasks every day. They have to go around, and the fact that they disagree politically about some pretty important stuff doesn't obviate the need to cooperate on a wide range of issues. And if those disagreements impeded us from cooperating on this wide range of issues, well, then we would find it much harder to get a mortgage, much harder to buy a car, much harder to send our kids to school, much harder to do all the things that are already not always so easy to do, even when we do have a common framework for settling our disagreements. Okay, so in a free society, people are going to disagree what justice is, and yet they still need to live together. Okay, so one further note, actually, before I move on with this slide. For those of you who are interested in the history of political thought, Waldron isn't coming up with this phrase completely out of the blue. He's really riffing on an idea that was popularized by a Scottish philosopher from the 18th century, a man by the name of David Hume, whom we're not reading in this course. We probably should, but I'm not as familiar with Hume as I am with some of these other authors. But David Hume talked about the circumstances of justice, right? And the fact that in society, justice was a value that helped us get along despite our disagreements about what the good life was. And I think Hume is primarily, when thinking about disagreements about conceptions of the good life, is talking about religious conceptions, although we could broaden it to other kinds of conceptions. But the idea is we disagree about what's good in life, right? Some people, and in particular, of course, we disagree about religious questions, and that would have been very important in his day. But just to make it more contemporary, not that religious disagreements have disappeared, but they've lost somewhat of their intensity. Catholics and Protestants are no longer murdering each other in the street over questions of theologies. But you might think about the questions that people disagree about what's of value in life, about how to live life, about, if you go back to Aristotle, what sorts of virtues are important, or at least more important than others. And so people have all these disagreements of what counts as the good, right? And justice is, to a certain extent, a set of principles that helps us live together despite our disagreements about the good. Waldron's pushing this one step further. It's not just that we just disagree about the good, it's also we disagree about justice itself. We disagree about how to resolve conflicts about the good. And so he wants to add theories of authority, ultimately, that help us sort out our disagreements about questions of justice. In other words, taking it one step further. Okay, so from the circumstances of politics, Waldron infers that in a free society, we will always have reasons to obey laws we disagree with, reasons that aren't just related to the desire to avoid punishment. In other words, we don't obey the law just because we want to avoid punishment, even when we disagree with the law. So, for example, laws about drunk driving. And I'm taking this off the top of my head, and I'm hoping it works out. But think about laws about drunk driving. There's a certain alcohol level that is acceptable, and that corresponds to a certain amount of alcohol ingested for each person. Now, we might disagree about how much alcohol is unsafe. You might have some people out there who say, look, any alcohol is unsafe, like drinking half a beer is unsafe. And others say, well, that's unsafe, but I'm willing to accept a society where people are walking around with, a 0.8 or a 0.7 liters, milliliters of alcohol, per pint of blood, or however they measure that stuff. Again, the point here is to say is that what makes you have the obligation to obey by whatever the stated limit is, whatever the legal limit is, despite the fact that you think it might need to be higher or lower. And one answer, of course, is you just don't want to be punished. You don't want to have a DUI on your record. You don't want to come to have all the inconvenience that comes with that. But you might also think that you have a duty to obey the law within certain bounds, whatever it says. That is to say, Waldron thinks that almost no matter how we resolve our disagreements in society, there's going to be some cases where we disagree with what the law ends up being. But we need to live in a legally ordered space. We need to be able to expect behavior from others. We need to be able to expect people to be sober to a certain level when we're driving, and we can adjust our behavior. You're going to drive very differently if you know that a lot of people are going to be, completely drunk on the road versus if you can expect everybody to be completely sober. That affects what your expectations are. And I think that issue of settled expectations and conforming to a particular rule in order to establish those expectations, and the need for everybody to do so, not just some people to do so, might provide reasons to obey the law, even if the law isn't set exactly where we would prefer it to be. Now, I think one thing that motivates Waldron's discussion here is that he's really explicitly reacting against a trend in political thought we've seen before. One that's really evident in Plato. It's also evident in Marx and other people we will encounter throughout the semester. And this trend is the tendency of political philosophers to reject politics itself. That is to say that in their ideal society, there ends up being no room for politics. Plato, for example, seems to assume that once the people have been properly enlightened, once people know the good, then they will simply do the good, and that most problems of politics stem from ignorance. That's Plato's view. Once we figure out what justice is and what the good is, then people will have no reason to act badly. Um, and so, from that perspective, moral disagreement is really just the product of ignorance, malice, stupidity, irrationality. And again, for Plato, it was mostly just ignorance, but we can add these other possible sources of disagreement, sources that Mike Humer talked about in week 1 of the course. But Plato's view is simply that once we know what the good is, we just put it into practice, and we don't really have. It's not clear what the space for disagreement is at that point. I mean, other than maybe technical disagreements, right? Once we may just not know what the answer is to certain questions. We know what principles would in principle answer the question, but there might still be a level of knowledge that we don't have in order to implement the just policy or what have you. But here, again, the politics essentially disappears, or at least what makes the politics so difficult in the real world disappears, because we don't generally cut each other's throats over exactly what level of nitrates is permissible in groundwater, or what level of particulates is permitted in the air in a particular city. I mean, those are issues that are to a certain degree important to public health, but it's hardly the sorts of issues that people tend to come to blows over. Although again, anything's possible in politics. But in any event, this view that ultimately, if we all were perfectly enlightened, we'd all end up agreeing on political issues, is a view that Waldron wants us to ultimately discard. Those are not the circumstances under which actual politics are conducted. I think it's easy, of course, to find political opponents who are all these things, who are ignorant, malicious, stupid, and irrational. But political disagreement itself, Waldron is arguing, is not reducible to these things. That is to say, some of these questions are just hard questions. Some of these questions are ultimately subject to interpretation, where, again, different people will prioritize different values, or will give priority to different values, or sort of balance things slightly differently. And we can't reduce all disagreement to, mere error or mere philosophical error. Okay, so Waldron thinks ultimately that we need to make disagreement part of our theories of politics. We need a duty to obey the law that isn't completely dependent on whether we agree with the law. We need to factor in the fact that merely because you disagree with the law isn't sufficient reason for you to disobey it. Even the fact that the law may not be in your interest may not be a sufficient reason to disobey it. Now, of course, that view that the law, whether you should obey the law or not, isn't completely dependent on whether we agree with it, is of course a view shared by Socrates, right? Of course, Socrates said that's the reason you don't agree with it is because you're wrong, right? Socrates is a mouthpiece for Plato, and Plato's view very clearly is that, of course, people are mistaken about whether they should follow the law or not, but once they acquire the proper education, they will lose those mistakes, or they will stop making those mistakes. But Waldron goes one step further than Socrates, right? He's saying one's obedience needs to be independent about whether the law is even just or right in the first place, in part because we have no basis for being certain that our view of justice is the correct one. And furthermore, even if we are quite certain of our position, we also need to show a certain amount of respect to the reason and rationality and values of other people whom we live in society with. And so to that extent, the law as we see it is going to be a mix, right? It's going to be a mix of rules that we agree with and rules that we disagree with. It's going to be a kind of compromise by necessity, because that is ultimately what the law is there to do, is there to mediate and provide us reasons to obey despite our disagreements. But that raises a further question, which is what could possibly justify that kind of obedience? Why should I ever obey a law that I, not only that I disagree with, but that I am 100% certain is unjust? Okay, So Waldron, to answer this question, only gives us the briefest of outlines, and I'm going to try to fill it in a little bit more, but understand that there's going to be some parts here that, uh, of necessity, because of the length of this lecture, I'm not going to be able to discuss. But Waldron's really going to be talking about seems to be alluding to two kinds of game theoretical situations when talking about the need to act in concert. That's his term, right? He says we need to act in concert on certain issues, and I will. So I'm going to talk briefly about two kinds of game theoretical situations that I often talk about in my introductory classes. So if you've taken American politics or international politics with me, it's highly likely that you remember these particular models, but let me talk about them briefly. First, let's talk about coordination problems because they're easy. Well, they're not always easy to solve, but they're fairly easy to describe. There are going to be situations in life where we as individuals want to coordinate our actions. We want to coordinate our actions more than we prefer to let everybody do what they please. So what does that mean? That means that we want to match our behavior with other people, or at least coordinate our behavior with other people more than we care how we coordinate with other people. Think about it. Imagine you're on a team, right? You want to. You may disagree about which system the coach is putting into place and which system the team should adopt. But at the same time, once the system has been put into place, you definitely don't want to play as if you're in another system, whether this is football or soccer or whatever team sport you prefer, basketball. You need to play with, you prefer, in other words, to play as a part of the system than to do your own thing, ruining the system that's in place. And I think we can see that in politics with things like traffic rules, right? In other words, you may disagree about the placement of a particular traffic light, whether it should be a stop sign or a red light. You may disagree about whether we should drive on the right or on the left. You may disagree about um, the speed limit in a particular area. But the point is that you prefer to have a set of common expectations. So you know what everybody else is going to do. You know how fast they're going to be driving. You know what rules they're following. You know the rules about passing. You know roughly how fast they're going to be going. You know whose turn it is to stop, whose turn it is to go. Again, all of those things make it possible for all of us to get where we're going. And if we didn't have at least some common traffic rules, we couldn't get where we're going as easily. Now, it's possible that there could be a better set of traffic rules out there. It might be true that driving on the left is just better than driving on the right. It might be true that there should be a stop sign there instead of a red light. But at the end of the day, what's important is that we all obey the rules as stated so that we can all get where we're going safely. So that's the coordination problem. And again, we see this in terms of contract law. We need to know what to expect from the people whom we do business with. We see this also when it comes to technological standardization, whether it's the width of rail gauges, for instance, or whether it's the handshake protocols for internet, or whether it's the country codes for dialing numbers in different countries. Again, those protocols are things that need to be agreed on at some level, even if you think there should be a different technical standard in place, even if you think there should be a different protocol. Even if you think that contract law should be strict liability rather than limited liability, or what have you. The point here is that you benefit from the fact that everybody's operating by the same rules, and you yourself prefer that everybody's operating by the same rules. And so that provides some grounding for the claim that Waldron's making, that it's necessary in some level to have a common framework, even where we disagree about what that framework should be. Now, there's a second set of problems, sort of similar to the first, but yet different, and maybe a little bit more complicated, called collective action problems. And the reason I raise this is because a lot of these coordination problems don't seem to be that similar to problems of disagreements about justice. In other words, these are disagreements, but they're often technical disagreements. Again, driving on the left, driving on the right, stop signs versus traffic light, should we have traffic circles at all? People get excited about these things, but they're not questions of justice. They're not questions about fundamental rights. They're just the questions about what the best way of organizing our traffic is, right? And so those coordination problems tend not to be the ones that map well onto onto Waldron's argument. But there's another class of problems that I think the map's better, and that's the collective action problem. And here, really, the collective action problem is a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma. If you've heard of the prisoner's dilemma, then this will be fairly straightforward. But let me try to explain it to you quickly. Sometimes it's better for me if I don't follow the rule, whether or not you do so. And similarly, it can be better for you if you don't follow the rule, whether or not I do so. And yet it can be the case that it's better for both of us if we follow the rule. Okay, that's going to be super abstract, so let me give you an example. Think about pollution abatement, the fight against air pollution. If I pollute and everybody doesn't, great. In some sense, I get the benefits of clean air, and I don't pay any of the costs of limiting my pollution. I can dump my stuff wherever I want. I can drive as dirty a car as I want, and as long as everybody else doesn't do the same thing, I can have a relatively clean environment without paying any of the personal costs of having one. Conversely, if I pollute and everybody else does, well, certainly that's too bad. But note that since the air that I breathe is wholly dependent on what other people do and very little on what I do, then I might as well go ahead and pollute. What's my incentive to restrict myself if no one else is restricting themselves? Remember, whether I get the good of clean air or not doesn't depend so much on what I do as what everybody else does. And of course, it should be obvious to you that everybody faces the same dilemma. What happens if I cooperate, if I restrain myself? What happens if I don't restrain myself? It turns out that no matter what anybody else does in a prisoner's dilemma, it's almost always better for you to not restrain yourself. And yet, isn't it true that everybody would be better off if everybody restrained themselves? Right? If we all do what's best for us, we end up in the polluted world. And the polluted world seems to be worse for all of us than the non-polluted world. Notice that's completely compatible with the claim that it's better for me if we live in a non-polluted world and I don't pay the costs. Because everybody is symmetrically situated, that is not an option that in some sense is stable. As soon as some people start not following the rule, everybody else will start not following the rule, and then the collective good, which is a clean air in this example, doesn't get, none of us get it, right, after a while. And so whether you think of clean air or climate change or biodiversity, or you could think of any number of goods that work this way, national defense works this way, paying your taxes to a certain degree works this way. Again, it seems that we have a class of reasons here where what's best for me and what's best for the community is not the same thing. And again, it seems like it's best for everybody if we have some framework of pollution restrictions, right? Now, Waldron says it's necessary for us to have a common rule about stuff. I don't know that living in a world with clean air is a necessity, but it's probably better than living in a world of maximum pollution. And I think people can reasonably disagree about just how clean the air needs to be, just like we can disagree about how high the speed limit needs to be, or how safe cars need to be built, or how safely cars need to be built. Again, people have different preferences about risk versus health. That's not new. That's part of the normal disagreement about politics. But it certainly does seem to be the case that almost nobody wants to live, in the Industrial Revolution, right, where you have basically no restrictions on pollution whatsoever, and thousands of people are dying of asthma related conditions and black lungs, and all the buildings are black, and London is basically a fog, basically what we would call today a smog, many days per year. Again, these seem like conditions that not even the most freedom-loving libertarian really wants to live in. So as a result, we're going to need some restrictions. And I think that's Waldron's point. We don't get to necessarily pick on our own, based on our own preference, what the particular policy will be. That's something that needs to be worked out through politics that have to do with negotiations with people we disagree with, who have a different sense about what the appropriate level of pollution in this instance is. But again, I think we can extend this to other types of issues where we disagree about what the policy should be. We have different sense of what is right in each situation, and the policy is going, and sometimes, you'll win, sometimes you'll lose, and sometimes you'll have to compromise. But the point here is that what the law is will ultimately be a reflection of a political calculus. And these situations seem both more common in coordination problem and seem pretty close to the problems where we disagree about justice. That is to say, it does seem to be the case that at least across some range of conditions, it's better for us to coordinate our behavior in order to have some policy on these issues. Okay, so in conclusion, we need laws capable of giving us reasons to obey, Waldron thinks, even when we disagree with their content. We need this because ultimately we need to go on with our lives under a stable, ordered framework for cooperation, despite our deep disagreements on some of the aspects, some of the rules that govern our cooperation. For Waldron, this means that ultimately we need to have two very different sorts of moral views about politics. We need to have a view about what government should do, and that's more like a theory of justice. But we also need a view about what government should do, given that we know that we live in a free society where reasonable people are likely to disagree with us. And that's more of a theory of political legitimacy, or a theory of authority. One that takes politics seriously, one that doesn't assume that everybody will just simply agree with you once you show them the truth. Well, they're not going to say, aha, well, of course you were right. How many times does that really happen, right? Nobody, when you try to explain to them your political views, generally says, aha, well, thank you for explaining that to me. Now I agree with you 100%. No, usually there's going to still be some residual disagreement. And Waldron's really saying that we have two sorts of questions that we need to be answered: a question about what should be done, and a question about what should be done given that we live in a society where people reasonably disagree about what should be done. And he's saying that it's really a mistake to confuse the answer to the first question with the answer to the second. Now, not everyone's totally convinced by Waldron. I expect some of you probably aren't. And I think there's at least two major reasons, or two major areas where I think Waldron needs to do some explaining. First, there's a lot of legislation where the debate is primarily over whether having a policy in common is necessary at all, not what it should be. And of course, that can cover areas where you might want there to be no policy, and that can cover areas where you think that there might be different policies that need to apply to different people. It's not entirely impossible to live in a sort of a polycentric society, or have polycentric law, where different laws apply to different people. We tend to think of laws applying to jurisdictions, that is to say to territories, and I think there's a lot of practical reasons why that makes sense. But in the past, we've definitely, and in the present, we continue to have laws that apply to certain people, right? So diplomatic immunity is an example. In the United States, it seems that veterans have a different set of rights than everybody else when it comes to a wide variety of government services. We can go back to other countries. We can look at the Ottoman Empire, for example, where people of different religions had different tax rates and different rights and obligations depending on what religion they were. Not so much about where they lived, but also what religion they subscribed to. Again, I'm not saying that those are good or bad, but I think it's worth noting when he says it's necessary to have a common framework, a lot of people will answer, no, it's not. Now, can Waldron push back here? Maybe. I mean, he can say, for instance, that no policy is still a policy. It's a policy of having no policy. But I'm not sure that counts as having a common framework. Or at least it seems severely question-begging. A second area where I think a lot of people may not be totally convinced by Waldron is that it's not clear how far he's moved us forward, right? So we disagree in good faith about theories of authority just about as much as we disagree about theories of justice. This is part of the interest, I think, of this particular unit on political authority, is to note that political authority can be grounded, or at least people have tried to justify it in a variety of ways. We saw that even Socrates tried on a few different explanations, right? There's consent, there's reciprocity, there's fair play, there's democracy, which itself can be justified in a variety of different ways. There's necessity, which is, of course, Waldron's view. There's all these different views about what justifies political authority, and people disagree about those nearly as much as they disagree about questions of justice. So how far have we moved forward, right? We've just substituted one series of disagreements for another series of disagreements. Um, okay, that being said, I think some of Waldron's points still are worth reiterating. It probably remains true that sometimes, maybe often, it is in our interest to live on a common framework of rules. Remember traffic rules. You may totally disagree about what the traffic rules are, but is it really the case that you shouldn't obey the current traffic rules as they are written? What happens if everybody feels that way, that they just can disobey the traffic rules? It just seems to me that there's some cases where it's he's obviously right that despite our disagreement, that it is in our interest to live under a common framework of rules. Whether that insight can be extended to the full range of areas where we have political disagreements, I'm not so sure. But certainly, he seems like he has a point some of the time. There's an insight here that I think is worth holding on to. Um, and it certainly is the case that sometimes the best answer to the question of why we should follow the law may be that it's in our interests, or maybe even necessary, the way Waldron says it, to live under a framework of laws despite our disagreements.